Right. Friday. Welcome everyone to the 2021 New Orleans Poetry Festival. I'm Sean from the NOPF board. Before we get started, I would like to thank some of our major sponsors. The New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation has hooked us up this year, and the Academy of American Poets has also hooked us up pretty good this year too. So we appreciate their support for keeping this festival free and open to all. Glad to see y'all here with us at this event. If y'all are looking for more events, go to nolapoetry.com. We have much more stuff for the rest of the week into the end of April. I'm going to pass it over to Ron now for this sweet panel.
Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Rone Shavers, and well, first off, thank you, Sean, Bill, Jonathan, and the entire staff of the NOLA Poetry Fest. Thank you for getting everything together, especially in these difficult times. It's much appreciated. Well, welcome to Prose Poetics. We're a panel that hopes to address the tenuous and not so tenuous, obvious and not so obvious distinctions that currently shape how we've come to define poetry as distinct from, say, varied forms of hybrid genre work and experimental prose. I should also add, really, that the aim of this panel is a proactive one, right? Rather than kind of definitively answer any questions, we just hope to raise a bunch more. And mostly through speaking, listening, and reflecting. We'll take questions at the end. Okay, so please hold your questions until after everyone has sort of had their chance to speak, right? And the speakers will go in alphabetical order. I'd like to introduce them and then read their bios, and we'll take it from there. Okay, our speakers tonight are John Beer, Rosebud Ben-Oni, Laura Goldstein, and Bronwen Tate. John Beer is the author of 2 books of poetry, Lucinda and the Wasteland and Other Poems, and also the editor of Poems 1963-1997 by Robert Lax. He lives in Portland, Oregon, and he teaches at Portland State University. He'll be speaking tonight on katabatic, hopefully I got that correct, unearthing. Rosebud Ben-Oni is the winner of the 2019 Alice James Award for If This Is the Age, We End Discovery. And she's also the author of Turnaround Bright Eyes, I think, XYXS, she can correct me if necessary, and 20 Atomic Sonics, which was published by Black Warrior Review last year. She's a recipient of a 2014 in New York State Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Poetry, and 2013 Canto Mundo Fellowship. Her work has appeared in Poetry, the American Poetry Review, the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, Poetry Society of America, the Poetry Review UK, Tin House, Guernica, and a whole laundry list long as my arm, other places. In 2017, her poem Poet Wrestling with Angels in the Dark was commissioned by the National September 11th Memorial in New York City. Laura Goldstein's first collection of poetry, Loaded Arc, was released by Trembling Pillow Press in 2013, whoop, whoop. And their second collection, Awesome Camera, was published by Make Now Press in 2014. They've also published several chapbooks with vibrant small presses across the country. Chapbooks are important. Don't forget your chapbooks, peeps, right? And recently they performed the collaborative piece, Future Freedom, an Abolitionist Anthem with Damon Locks under the auspices of the Poetry Foundation. They like cats and they teach critical writing, thinking and writing, literature and poetry workshop at Loyola University, Chicago. I should also mention that Laura is a co-curator of the famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, Red Rover Reading Series with Jennifer Carmen, who's in the house, thank you, Jennifer, in Chicago, right? She'll be reading from Prose Poetry Phenom, HD, Renee Gladman, and me. Shavers. Now I'm meeting Laura. Finally, last but not least but not last, is Bronwen Tate. And her collection, The Silk the Moths Ignore, is forthcoming from Inlandia Institute in 2021. Bronwen is also assistant professor of teaching in the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. Her poems and essays have appeared in CV2, the Bennington Review, the Rumpus, Journal of Modern Literature, and Contemporary Literature. She'll be reading tonight from Circling the Question, Writing and Teaching at the Intersection of Poetry and Prose. And I should also mention, because I accidentally skipped over it, that Rosebud will be reading Poetry and Prose as Twisted Sisters. Darling, do both! Exclamation mark. Now, without any further ado, let's just dive right in. I'd like to introduce the always exceptional John Beer. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ron, and thanks too for putting together this panel. Delayed from 2020, but worth a year's wait. I hope it's really a delight to be here with my fellow panelists, and I'm also very grateful to all the organizers of this this installment of the NOLA Poetry Festival. I'm looking forward very much, I hope, in the future to actually being in New Orleans for this, but that'll be in the future. So my piece of all this is called Catabatic Unearthing, and I'm taking that phrase from the translator Olivia Lott, who translated this book Catabasis by the Colombian poet Lucia Estrada. Came out last year from Eulalia Books, and really a remarkable book. And I think and most of what I plan to do is actually just read a bit and talk about Estrada's poems, and I may be closing with a bit of my own work. But I want to start out by unpacking this idea of catabatic unearthing. You know, I'm just going to put it in the chat because why not see it too? Which is Lott's phrase for the act of translation, literary translation as a going under, right? Catabasis in the classical context refers to the journey to the underworld, and as such is bound up with the origins of poetry itself. Think about the journey that Inanna undertakes in the Descent of Inanna, the Sumerian epic, often considered one of the very first poetic compositions, or one of the first surviving poetic compositions. Catabasis also figures really prominently in Virgil's Aeneid, which is a point that I'll be coming back to a bit. But in Book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas, in order to fulfill his destiny as the founder of Rome, after refugee from Troy, founder of Rome, has to undertake a journey to the underworld. And of course, that poetic centrality of the catabatic journey continues to the present day. Think of, for instance, of Alice Notley's Descent of Villette. And I think, more generally, that figure of the descent through the underworld is something that one can locate throughout Notley's work and through the work of many others as well. But what does it mean to say, yeah, I mean, and are we not all in the midst of our own journey through through one thing and perhaps ultimately up into another thing, one hopes. But for Lott, the idea of the catabasis is bound up, as I said, with translation. The idea that by going into the source text and emerging with a new text, one's undertaking a kind of underworld journey, and it's a journey that that brings with it unearthing. And I want to take that in two senses. For Lott, she's foregrounding the idea of discovery, that you go down and you bring back something that wouldn't otherwise be accessible. But I think that in unearthing, we can also hear there the sound of unworlding, of unmaking settled understandings. And that idea of settled understanding and settlement, again, I think is going to be useful to bear in mind as we think about Virgil and as we think about Lucia Estrada. And finally, I want to propose that poetic prose too, the topic of our panel being writers on the line, that one way that writers can find themselves possibly on the line is through undertaking a journey from verse into prose and perhaps back out or perhaps remaining there. But that the sort of dissolution of the line that happens in poetic prose, the subsumption, perhaps, I think that's arguable. We'll probably be talking about these sorts of issues over the course of the next hour, but by the sentence and by the paragraph, the spreading out to the margin of the page is again a kind of katabatic journey that I'm arguing brings with it the possibilities for productive discovery, unearthing, and a kind of undoing of the world as we understand it. So in a way, Ron, I'm just realizing now this is kind of a companion piece to the, last time we were together, I was talking about world building. And so now this is world undoing. And of course, those two, they're complementary activities. You can't have one really without the other. Okay, I'm going to read a bit from Estrada. This is her poem called Mare Nostrum. They cross a stretch of salt, a liquid desert, a word everyone knows. They cross their own fear of loss, of not finding what they're after, of not knowing what was once theirs and now roams beneath the sea. In the depths, less and less fathomable. Far away, near the quiver that simmers in their eyes and condemns the gaze. Not a single footprint to follow. The trace of a bleeding animal has been stripped away by wind. Doubts have been thickened by waves. Nobody will gather pleas, ravaged hands, red sunset sky that won't come back the same. Swayed by memory, their eyelids shut out night. It's all sun and biting silence, barely a whisper of what life was. Nothing before them. They gave up earth, and earth wouldn't lay claim to them. Hundreds of eyes sink their riches. Childhood's lukewarm light lowers beneath the cracks of ships. Water has lost sight of its search, and soon will untie the knots of its heart. Each teardrop dangles the day's trajectory. Minutes no longer count, just the thirst for dropping anchor at an unknown, forgiving port. Thirst for swallowing visions, thirst for unthinking. A mass of bodies with nothing but flight handed down to them. Who will tell them that the sea belongs to nobody, leads nowhere, that blind to hours and cloudy time, it never retraces its steps? So, that's Mare Nostrum, Our Sea, a poem about the Mediterranean that, as I'm reading it, is at one the same time a vision of what's going on in the Mediterranean right now, the refugee crisis that continues fatally, but it's also a comment on Virgil and the Trojans in their ships in the Mediterranean with nothing but flight handed down to them. And in particular, I think it's making a connection between the imperial vision that animates Virgil's epic, although I would certainly recognize that Virgil's own stance toward that imperial vision is really complex and not necessarily definitively decided. But that for Estrada, there is a continuing link between that vision and what's going on in the Mediterranean and in Colombia today. And I suppose, I think I'm going to just close in the interest of time to say that it seems to be part of the work of the katabatic unearthing is in this poem an anti-imperialist vision of a sea that belongs to nobody and that leads nowhere, much like the language of the poem, which is untracked by the poetic line. Again, thinking about Virgil, the sort of omnipresent figure in the Aeneid of the boat on crossing the sea, and the rose in the farm that's been put to pasture, and the turning of the poet's verse. And I want to say that I think Estrada is giving up all three of those at once, and inviting us into, to take a journey whose trajectory is much more mysterious, and hopefully leads us to a less violent future. Our borders are kind of, I think borders make underworlds, and maybe I'll stop there. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you so much, John. John, thank you. Right, that was really impressive and illuminating. Next up, we have Rosebud Ben-Oni. And again, she will be presenting on poetry and prose as Twisted Sisters, Darling, Do Both. Take it away, Rosebud.
This is a nice transition because I'm actually from the border of the Rio Grande Valley in Mexico. I have family on both sides. My mother is Mexican, and this talk is dedicated to her. She converted from Catholicism to marry my father, who was at one time an Orthodox Jew. Very interesting childhood. And this talk is also dedicated to the poet Carolina Ibáez, who is a Canto Mundo fellow as well. She is half Cuban and half Palestinian. So I've always found, well, she's one of my best friends, but I've also found such a sisterhood in her, as someone mixed and as someone who straddles two different worlds. So this is going to begin with a quote from a poem that I put in the chat, which is also the title of her book. You asked me to talk about the interior. Highly recommend. The way a searchlight listens over a lake, it was the prayer word out of your mouth, your thousand-noun request. It goes up to the fluorescent weather. Was ivory inlaid box, was hurtle and burn, burning through the infinite. Your overbright comet was made of stone, made of berries and plastics and box tops and eggshells. It was like the word having reached the ear. Carolina Ibáez. My mother's name is Esperanza. That means hope. My mother's jaw has to be rebuilt every 5 years or so. They use bovine bone. Yesterday, she told me she has an infection in the bone now, and also they think the graft did not take. She has been here before. She finds a way to speak new each time this happens, a new verbal mobility to hide her discomfort. There are many times I've misunderstood her and she me. But tonight when she does speak, I hear the subtle realigning of the mandible, the small tired hand I do not see pressing down at a spot probably tender and painful, so that I might understand her. I feel very far away from her right now. I rarely speak to her of my own interiors, the neurological misfiring and resulting numbness that I explain away as a poetic warfare rather than grapple with the disease I'm beset with. My mother and I do not like to call each other their given names. It would mean defeat, conformity, falling into a fate written on national averages and soulless statistics, and above all, doctors who think they know better. Each year, a new urgency of falling into a fate written on national averages and soulless statistics, these new resistances from our bodies and ourselves. We don't play, my mother and I, with work and time and love. Neither of us sleep much. A recent discovery that's always looked us in the face, our eternal dark circles and lean, hungry gaze. We have given time to think about this by not thinking we had time to spare. There developed something stronger and more natural than love between us. It took time to get here. We could not be more different, she and I, but we are not for unhurried replies on the subject of medical premonitions. The infection in her bone is a particularly strong one, but she reminds me that she is stronger. I believe her. It has been long and remains a messy understanding in the works. It has been made public in front of other family, among strangers in strip malls, crossing the community beaches of Padre Island. Sometimes we don't think it the short distance from sand to water before it shrinks any definition or declaration of a theoretical overarching love, shrinks into a stone we often lob at each other. It frees us too from expecting Carolina Ebade's overbright comet that in reality is made of berries and plastics and box tops and eggshells, those things natural and unnatural, those things we saved and those we threw away. A particular poem written in the past tense of the things she was and was like when the words, and in Carolina's poem, the words pollinated the dark, there was darkness there, like the after hours inside a library. My friend's words sit within me. Speech as fertilizing both the dark and darkness, speech as unbearing lightness. I call this place Space Horse. I'm not quite yet ready to share this with either one of them, so let's start here. A house of books is a house of worship in my house, and neither of us think either empty of it. Both of us, or rather my mother and I, or rather Carolina and I, or else, in this case, we're all emptied of purpose. Spiritual purpose being their main purpose, the books we love, that which nourishes and claims, which challenges and discontents the prayer word out of our mouths. Carolina and I had a bond almost instantly, while it took years to bring my mother and I together. In the everyday speech and the most unlyrical prose, we are all very real. That is, people wildly different from one another. Carolina is my friend. My mother is my birth mother. Neither of these facts are lost on me. Perhaps it's only now when it's so difficult for my mother to speak that I understand her, because we are not without, in Carolina's words, thousand noun requests which go up to the fluorescent weather. My mother and I are learning to be silent together on a phone line. That is a compromise of her rimshot exclamatory and dead-end declaratives. That is crossover into my lyrical world that uproots and twists not what is happening, but what might happen. The rare moment I am in dash when I take a breath. We don't see it as wasted time. We ask less and less of each other, though this I know will be short-lived. The understanding inevitably grows messier. It grows despite our bodies would like to demand of us. This is where I fall into your words, Carolina. This, my uncomplicated grammar of your unstilled life interiors. I would like to say not world interiors of future countries. Say not borders. Say not either or. Say not, of all things, another war. Say historical, say phantom, say real pain our jaws might bring, about new ways of speaking, for I am now lost, sometimes out of order, my enigmatic body, caught between the two worlds in which I've only begun to study such radiant science, if science is to paraphrase Dia in the film Interstellar. All we can do is admit what we do not know. Every day I fail at things large and small with very good intentions. Every day, no matter what, I force myself out of bed for the grasp in my mother's jaw that do not take for the rare words we decide to exchange. Say chronic pain is not my world entire. Say chronic pain is my world entire. Say world what you cannot bear without singing, that poetry divines a new consciousness of what it means to be human, both by our single selves and in disorderly togetherness. Say that where poetry twists a new real, perhaps a more real from everyday speech, we can say what would most replace us. Say you ask me to talk about my interior, and this is what I find whirling out of me. I'll close with this. Poet wrestling with the multi-horse verse theory. This is my interior. We'll be space horse when we do not say strange horse. A wild unplaced, there's no doomsday or danse macabre reaching beyond seven-sealed grace. And no seams to swat as they suck all that chalice luck, no 12 of never rivals who buck, not a single man hightailing a flame of space gurmkak that no one sets loose, whistling into the gargantuan dark hoarseness, to nearly and neatly vamoose, all to never quite get there, because nothing ever arises in or at space horse so far from your thinking that this on earth is how things work in outer space, strangely. And it is not why you should leave for the multi-horse first. It's not a resort to grasp via rocket or fear or Copenhagen's math. Nothing in space horse is clear or quite adds up, and I regret this not one bit how space horse waves do not fall or fail, but bifurcate each and every super space position horse. And when we said horse love never dies, we meant every star horse is quite fine, being neither both dead and alive. There's no divorce horse of the horse and space horse, no making strange horse, unless it's their exosphere engulfing all your Earth to June fundamental forces, all your low grade and crummy waves functioning, collapsing, or all sorts of quantum gunk in our multi-horse verse funk, where one world is enough, and also diverging off course, so that every horse happens entirely as its own source. Oh, imagine such boundless co-horse existence, say. A sliver here exists on your planet, for which I have split within highland cattle whose star horse alien elders mixed a prick of yak horn, and every day moss, rootless and spiraling its rough scales to the remora savanna trees where I'm straddling. Perhaps two more of me, splitting off even more space Icelandic course descendants with magnificent curves in my thorns. No, I'll have none of this one world sorrow. Somewhere in space horse, we are meeting an endless field of vegetable Icelandic horse equus. Oh, imagine what we would be, all that space yak horse photosynthesis growing so much planet. Imagine all that quantum and classic reaching a new you, even out of a main splintering, every tolting and nay thrashing. We. I know this was weird. Thank you for listening.
May we, that was so cool. You got me code switching. All right, super cool, amor.
Thank you.
No, that was amazing. That was incredible. Thank you so much for that, Rosebud. All right, thank you so much. Wow, that was really cool. Next up is Laura Goldstein. Once again, their first collection of poetry, Loaded Ark, was released by Trembling Pillow Press back in 2013, and the second collection, Awesome Camera, was published by Make Now Press in 2014. They've also published several chapbooks with vibrant small presses around the country, and recently they performed the collaborative piece Future Freedom, an abolitionist anthem with Damon Locks through the Poetry Foundation. They teach critical thinking and writing, literature, and poetry workshops at Loyola University in Chicago. Whoop, whoop. And they're the co-curator of the Red Rover reading series with Jennifer Carmen, who's in the house, huzzah, in Chicago as well. Once again, thank you, Laura. And she'll be reading from Prose Poetry Phenom, HD, Renee Gladman, and me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to the organizers of the festival for making it possible this year. I want to thank Ron for putting this panel together in 2019 and again in 2020, so we can be here in 2021, and organizing all of us through all of this. And Ron, I'm sorry, I don't know how to use a reply all button. I first met Ron at the And Now Festival of Innovative Writing that was held at Notre Dame University in 2018. Is that right? Was it 2018, you guys? Was it? Okay, that's what I thought. We instantly became BFFs, and since then, I've been discovering all sorts of connections between us, like he went to high school with my cousin and was giving his dissertation when a colleague of mine was entering the program at UIC, and she's actually here in the audience, Julie Fiorelli. About 10 years ago, I met John Beer when he curated the Poets Theater here in Chicago. Poets became actors, figuring their bodies into space, reading into colors and light Fiona Templeton's version of Bluebeard. We crossed genres in order to explore our own sense of poetics. We seeded poesis into newer forums. We pieced together something rarely seen and entirely of the moment. Poesis gives rise to all the types of poetry. Poetry is the parent, and prose is the heir apparent. Inside the beginning of language, après la poésis, prose becomes a continuous flow, biblical and rooted in the technology of the page. When we experiment here and now, what borders of these evolved genres do we defy? When we experiment, what might we find is that we have deviated from the standard, an action which is a type of queerness. What might it mean to write queerly? And then how does the text become in relation with the community it enters? I've considered for a while that there are multiple types of queerness and that a broader recognition of how difference functions in society amounts to a heightened appreciation of how diversity functions in nature. It makes everything stronger. Each person might become truer to themselves, each text unique, each poetic emergent, each being beautiful. HD is maybe best known for her work as an imagist, a term coined for her by her lover Ezra Pound in 1912, who was busy literally making a scene that would later define modernism as a legitimate category of the canon. Legitimate, I'm sorry, I forgot the, I put them around canon too, legitimate. While Pound and his friend William Carlos Williams were attending University of Pennsylvania near HD's home in Upper Darby, right outside of Philly in 1903, Williams observed in his autobiography in 1951, the image of an intense young woman seeking to step outside the confinement of Victorian conventions. Williams was fascinated by her provocative indifference to rule and order. She started to write poems, she told him, by splashing ink from her pen all over her clothes to give her a feeling of freedom and indifference. She wandered in the woods and fields, climbed fences, and once startled Williams by the ecstatic abandon with which she embraced a summer storm. That was from the Poetry Foundation. In the meantime, HD was writing poetry that crystallized small moments of flowers, color, and droplets of the world around her, as in her first collection, Sea Garden, published in 1916. In 1921, she wrote a trilogy of prose poems, Strophe, Antistrophe, and Epode. Here's a bit from Strophe. I love you would have no application for the moment. I love you waits with cold wings furled, stands a cold angel shut up like cherry buds not yet half in blossom. The cold rain and the mist and the scent of wet grass is in the unpronounceable words, I love you. Here, HD whirls her words around in a storm, a real world of writing. She lets herself go into time instead of still images. Her use of verb tense reveals that she is in multiple places on the timeline grammatically, subjunctive, suggestive, and in the present, maybe even the future. The mystical phrase, I love you, exists outside of the kind of time that can be captured in an image in a poem. Instead, this unpronounceable utterance would have no application for the moment, somewhere not yet half in blossom. In her prose, she stretches time beyond the moment and into periods that persist between instants and perpetuity. In Antistrophe, she writes, flowers fall, unreasonable, out of space and counterpoint of time, beaten by the metronome of year and year, century on century. The metronome is wound up, will go on beating for our lifespan, a metronome tick of year, 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 life for life, heartbeat on heartbeat beats the metronome. After unwrangling herself from Pound and eventually her husband, Richard Aldington, HD let herself loose into time towards many loves, deviating from the tradition of marriage to be with both men and women. She kept writing and finding new forms, fractured and fractal. Renee Gladman wrote Calamities to document a period of time in which she was invited to and then subsequently dismissed from a position at Brown University for seemingly obscure reasons that become clear in this book of experimental prose. Her bio on the back states that she is, quote, preoccupied with lines as they play out in the interstices of poetry and fiction. As with HD's experimental prose, Calamities in particular is preoccupied with time. Here, the hybrid memoir, narrative, poetry, essay is a perfect form for examining how time passes on the page itself. Gladman starts each chapter of Calamities with the same phrase, I began the day. And the first section of the book explains that, quote, at some point, I started working on the beginning and end of something at once. In the fourth section, she writes, I began the day thinking that in order to write a talk on the ongoing story, I would need to incorporate it into these essays I've been writing about my life. Experimental prose is often hybrid. It experiments with and incorporates what other genres offer and pulls away from the problems of time that poetry often presents in the space of a single page or several pages with broken lines. She writes, I'd been arguing that the problem of poetic time was a component of fiction, but now I saw fiction could not concern itself with problems of time. With such an attitude that deviates from the traditional teachings of genre, how might Gladman fit in at Brown, such an esteemed institution? In one section, Gladman tells us that I began the day in a faculty meeting, though I was late in coming, having just walked into the room. I didn't know how I had gotten there. The doors were closed. That's how I knew I was late. And much worse, locked when I quietly tried to open them. A senior member opened the door and thought it would be a good time to play a joke on me, saying, you can't come in here. I didn't think it was funny, since being junior often meant that I couldn't. At some point in Calamities, Gladman decides to start drawing and considers this practice an extension of prose writing, an actual examination of how the sentence looks and feels. She writes of this turn, the problem was in the form of a question. In order to draw, was how it began. Would one have to give up writing if to keep on writing one needed to draw? Writing and drawing being identical gestures made with the hand. This is a poetics that applies to Calamities itself, as well as the experimental drawings that Gladman made while writing the book. One gets the sense that she perhaps went through a transformation as she explored these questions. At the beginning of the book, she began the day one way, but by the end of the book, her writing has become markedly different, her own text having finally made its way inside her and changing her. She writes, one of my favorite words was in my mouth, and I was torn between chewing and swallowing it so that it could become a part of me. I always thought I was a poet. A popular poet once wrote a pamphlet called Poetry is Not a Project, which I read but couldn't relate to. It actually made me kind of angry. She explained what poetry could and couldn't do. Like I said, I couldn't relate. Each time I start a project, I deliberately start with a different poetics based on how the structure of my present being might translate as a form. For instance, for the project Golden Infection, a triptych of subjects, infection, the sun, and drama. Within infection, the common cold, HIV, Lyme disease, and the 2016 election. The sun, every day. For drama, Oedipus Rex, Othello, and Dr. Faustus. Another prominent poet told me that maybe what I was writing wasn't poetry. Does this sound like poetry or prose? You tell me. I'll give you an example. Yesterday it was raining and I was really sick, so I went to an immediate care clinic, and a doctor came in and looked in my ears and throat and said, there's nothing I can give you. Where do you work? He laughed in disbelief at my answer. Why did you laugh? I asked. Do I not appear to be someone who could have that job? No, that's not it at all, he said. I didn't know there were still jobs like that. So I stepped into the rain and then out of it and onto the bus. "Where do you work?" asked the driver. He nodded at me when I answered and pulled the bus onto a bridge. We talked a bit about getting a job somehow and working and who gets to make decisions and how we're assigned value and how that doesn't exactly feel human. I got off the bus and back into the rain, and I got better about a week later. Later on in the project, I let the sentences expand away from each other to let in more air. We experimental writers use genres as touchstones, as if moving between areas on a playground, building structures with elements of each. Fiction gives us fantasy. Poetry gives us power. Drama gives us a demiurge. I don't care what it's called really, what I write. These preconceived notions of care and collide. Like I said, I'm inside of this egg, a cloud that's just about to be born. And if you were the instructor, what would you say? What I usually say to my students is, okay, I'm your reader now.
Wow. Yeah. Speechless. Well, yes. Awesome. Yeah, I'll just be moderator then. Okay. That was really great. Wow. Yeah, I'm almost speechless. But you know, last but not least but not last is the ever awesome, super incredible, right? You know, Grand Mistress herself, Bronwen Tate, okay, whose collection, The Silk the Moths Ignore, is forthcoming from Inlandia Institute sometime out this year, correct? Right? Like, give us a month when you can, okay?
We're talking maybe September?
Maybe September, super cool, super cool. Bronwen's assistant professor of teaching in the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, which congrats, mazel tov. We won't have to go back into the whole thing, right? And her poems and essays have appeared in CV2, the Bennington Review, the Rumpus, Journal of Modern Literature, and Contemporary Lit. She'll be reading from Circling the Question, Writing and Teaching at the Intersection of Poetry and Prose. So welcome, Bronwen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the contemporary literature bit is an essay about Harriet Mullen that I'm really excited about. It hasn't come out yet, but it's coming soon, so keep an eye out for that one. So I'm joining you from Vancouver, from the Point Grey campus, which is on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. And I'm going to talk a bit about sort of teaching and basically race through some books that I love to teach that I feel like fit interestingly into this line between poetry and prose. Some of them might be super familiar to you. Hopefully there'll be a few that you're less familiar with. And then I'll talk just a little bit about some structures that have been helpful both for me as a writer and for working with students in this area. So I'm going to share the screen. So at least you'll be able to see the covers and some keywords as I take you on this wild racing tour of some excellent books. So sharing screen, Keynote. Are we there? Yeah, okay, awesome. So when I started to teach a class called Art as Inquiry, and I wanted to look at poems that ask questions and lyric essays, and this was sort of my initial brainstorming. So I think you'll see some keywords that have come up with others today. So essay, inquiry, other voices, argument, claim, research, archive, lyric, the body, subjectivity, media, multimedia. So this was sort of me starting to just see what is the terrain that I was thinking in. And then I began with some models and some experiments, because I feel like, especially for students who are new to something, seeing some ways people have approached the thing can open up some possibilities, of course, of sharing me. And with all of these texts, I invited students to think sort of, what is this text doing that we would call poem-like or would call lyric? What is this text doing that we might call essay-like or memoir-like or prosy? And what strategies can we observe at the level of the book, at the level of the page, at the level of the sentence? So I began with Anne Carson's classic glass essay, right? And one thing that's awesome about that is that it's available fully on the Poetry Foundation website. So you can start there and students can kind of sample it before they commit to the class. They don't have to buy anything. And it just brings together both lyric and essay on the page so clearly. So there's inquiry and there's also yearning, right? And it begins us thinking, what does it mean to have thinking and feeling happening on the page together? So what do we do when we see, you know, this essay in verse that has Emily Bronte and Wuthering Heights, but also these intimate depictions of caring for her aging mother, grief about the end of a relationship. So we have this argument analysis right up against vulnerability and vision. And so we start to ask, you know, what does it mean to have an essay and break it into lines? What are those lines doing? What does it mean to put, you know, your mother eating toast right next to a close reading of Bronte? Next, another classic, Maggie Nelson's Bluets. And this is the book that kind of gave me the thought around circling the question. So it's a text that takes the form of a series of numbered prose paragraphs, sort of like a philosophical text, right? But rather than proceeding through this sort of reasoned argument, they leap wildly around in terms of subject, in tone, in time. And we have sort of reflections, meditations on how visions work, quotes from philosophers, alongside stories of a lover, stories of a friend's devastating accident, and glimpses of the color blue and the sort of obsession with the color blue. So both as sort of beautiful things like lapis or indigo, but also as like a tarp that you see out of the corner of your eye or a little shard of plastic on the ground. So for this, I invited students to pick an emotional or relational thing in their lives, an intellectual or aesthetic question, and some element of the observed world, and practice leaping between those things, but also echoing back to earlier things. So it's in this way, it's sort of a circling the question, right? So rather than approaching something head on, you come at it from this angle, you come at it from that angle, you jump to something in a different point in time, but then you echo back a keyword or a question. Next, Kate Colby's Dream of the Trenches. So Dream of the Trenches is a collection of prose sections, sort of larded with quotes and lists and bits of poems. And there's a lot of critique there. So critique of Woolf and Stein and what it means to write after these major modernists, but also of Ben Lerner and Juliana Spar, what people are doing. There's also this involving of the personal in the critical and a real acknowledgement of ambivalence. So what does it mean to be really drawn to something, but to also have reservations about it and to hold both of those on the page? It's also a text that's really invested in strategies of interruption. So it has parentheticals, it has neologisms and puns. So there's sort of a constant wordplay happening and these metatextual breaks that pull you out of whatever you're reading and back to sort of the text as this written thing and language as something that's always partially getting at and partially failing to get at whatever we're thinking about. For students, I invited them to approach this with a question that Colby raises. She says, how complicit are you in your obsessions and what do they do in time? So this was kind of the key phrase that we used to enter this and enter their own writing. How complicit are you in your obsessions and what do they do in time? Next, we looked at Claudia Rankine's Don't Let Me Be Lonely. And the focus that I brought to this was around media and mediation. So it's a book that uses prose, lines, and images. So images, especially of TV screens, images of pill bottle labels, images of writing on a wall, and especially to think through public and private and how our experiences are mediated by technology. It was fascinating to return to this book, which I had read when it first came out, but to feel a kind of distance historically from it as well. She's so interested in TV and she's sort of writing just after 9/11. And so there's all this awareness of changing changes to say airport security or that kind of thing. But the students who were reading it with me had never known anything else, many of them. And rather than TV, the sort of haunting and intrusive presence in their lives was instead their smartphone or the internet, which mediated some ways similarly in its kind of bringing the individual and the collective together in uncomfortable ways, or blurring personal and public, but also in some ways in very different ways from how the TV that Rankine is looking at functions. So here I invited students to think about that mediation and to sort of even bring its presence onto the page. So we had things where there were screen captures of memes or text threads, and that mediation of technology was showing up in their work. Next, we looked at Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, which is a memoir that tells a story of surviving an abusive relationship through a series of lenses. So dream house is this key phrase, both sort of for the house they lived in together, for the relationship. But rather than going in a chronology, the book kind of takes all of these lenses. So we get dream house as different genres or formal elements or literary tropes or cultural commonplaces. So picaresque, erotica, exercise in point of view, unreliable narrator, time travel, or word problem. And I'd say that Machado uses comparison then, or this kind of perspectival approach, as a way that kind of gets away from chronology's heavy-handed cause and effect. So instead of this happened because this happened, it's sort of taking this complex experience over time, but instead approaching it, what if we look at it this way? What if we look at it that way? If we invoke this term, what becomes visible? And there's also some amazing enacting. So there's a lipogram section, there's a choose your own adventure section, there's this deja vu that's amazing, like repetition and variation that appears at 3 different points. So there was a lot there for people to like directly imitate or enact in their own work, as well as this question of what becomes visible when we pick a kind of watershed experience and examine it through this perspectival lens that moves and sort of holding it up to the light in different ways. Next, we looked at Tahimba Jess's Olio, which is a book that engages in intense formal virtuosity to talk about the history of Black performance. And the more time I spent with it, the more it became clear to me that in able to talk about Black performance, Jess needed to demonstrate the sort of skill and agency and intention and craft that he wanted to make us see in the people that he was writing about. So this is a wild book. It has these texts that you can read up and down both ways. It has these moments that are like quotes from 2 people that both read independently, but you can also read across the lines and see that one writer is talking back to the other. So it gives all these ways of thinking about archival material, what it means to take on a persona, especially a persona of a group that you have a connection to. This sort of multi-directional reading, these crowns of sonnets that can be read multiple ways, and rewriting or writing into a text as a response. Yeah, amazing book. And finally, we read Anne Boyer's The Undying. And this is an account of surviving breast cancer that questions absolutely everything. And Boyer has talked about the sort of breast cancer memoir as having personal pain set against this kind of backdrop where nothing is really called into question. But this book instead questions who does the work of care, what are the drugs made of, and where do they come from? Where does the contaminated urine end up? What assumptions get made about bodies and priorities? So this book, I feel like, invited students to think about foreground and background, and maybe especially in a typical narrative, what falls into the background or remains unquestioned, and what would it mean to bring that into the foreground. It's also a book that invites us to think about bodies within systems and institutions, right? So rather than the body on its own, sort of how are we, and she talks about like the architecture and the liturgy and the ritual of all these systems. And she's focusing especially on the hospital and the cancer pavilion, right? With its absence of beds and confusing layout. But it's an invitation for students to think about what systems, whether it's the school or the system of law or system of the mall, right? What are these sort of public spaces that we move in and out of? And how do they tell us to behave? What do they do to us? Some strategies that we looked at in this book were around defamiliarization. So one thing that Boyer does is talk about these medical experiences in language that sort of assumes that we know nothing about them. So rather than receiving them, we see just how like weird they truly are, or sometimes about slowing something way down. So rather than going at it at a pace that we're used to, we're sort of seeing each tiny step of it. And there's also this process, I would say, of like constellations of inquiry. So at any given moment, there's a like looking at all the pieces of that moment. Who is in the room? What does it mean if you can't get a note? What does it mean if you need to go to work? Who's making a decision? What policy is behind a thing? So not just the immediate effects, but how can that constellate out into broader systems, other questions? Whew. All right, that's the tour. Now I'll talk just briefly about the moment when I said, all right, now go write something else on your own, emerging out of these things or what you'd like. So some things I did to help scaffold this were project proposal questions, and I'll show you those in a moment. I also invited students to do a writer's research portfolio where they went out and found both sources. So depending on what they were writing about, they would find things that would sort of give them information, give them context, give them background, but also models that would sort of show possible formal strategies for approaching what they wanted to do. We did a group critique using critical response process. And I also had students fill out these pre-workshop and post-workshop memos, which I'm happy to chat with any about if you're interested. And now I'll just show you these questions because I think they're useful for me in my writing and might be useful for you as well. So first is, what question or questions do you want to explore through your writing? What is your personal stake in this question? How are you connected to it? How does this question reach beyond you? What research might enrich your writing on this question? What shape will your writing take? How might you approach this question formally? What appeals to you about this formal approach? And what can I help you think through or offer support on as you begin the project? So that's it. Thanks so much.
No, that was really super amazing. Thank you. John, I just love how it sort of comes full circle too, because John started us off with unearthing, right? And just the theory of unearthing. And then Rosebud gave us sort of like the praxis, you know, like, and then Laura just really sort of shows you how like stuff gets packed together and kind of querying the line of everything. And then you go and you just like, it comes full circle. You kind of just unearth all the formal methodologies that are at place, you know, in all these texts. So that was really just brilliant. Let's open it up for questions. And I don't know how this would actually really work in a Zoom thing. Maybe put it in the chat, or, you know, I'll leave that to say Jonathan and Sean, but yeah, like I'd love to, you know, I would otherwise hog all your time and turn into a chatty Cathy and like a giggly Hermes. So let's just get some questions going on. Okay.
Pop them in the chat or unmute yourself and say what you got to say.
Okay. Well, people, I guess, are formulating them. I have sort of one question, and that I mean, I don't want to pop it in the chat, but just, you know, well, because once again, it's, well, with their form, right? And how much importance should we place on form? You know, be it poetic or literary. Just anybody can tackle that if they want.
I'll start
Okay.
by saying a lot. I mean, the way that I understand form, the way that I read form is that it is part of the message of the piece. So like when I'm visually taking in the text, how it is crafted onto the page. Like I talked about the technology of the page a little bit in my talk, like how the writer is or is not conscious of how their work is going to appear on the page and then to the reader. I do think that placing importance on form, depending on the writer. So I think that's an interesting question, Ron, because, depending on the writer and, learning how to read a text, like when the text teaches you how to read it, sometimes form is instrumental in that, especially with like longer form poetry. So especially when we're talking about the line between poetry and prose, I feel like that's one of the tools that experimental writers have at their disposal is like, okay, what am I going to suggest here? Am I going to make a suggestion that this is a series of poems, but that's going to be a little deceptive, as the reader keeps reading, or that this is a commentary. So the form definitely, I think, sets you up. I mean, Ron, even if I can comment a little bit on Silverfish, that the form kind of sets you up. Oh, this is a novel. But then when you're reading it, it's kind of like, oh, there's a lot more going on here, and this as an experimental novel, like I really appreciated being set up in the genre of novel so that I would have like some sort of orientation to the text. But then that kind of gave me a stability within which to explore all the other things that you were doing with, by experimenting with that genre.
So I'll keep my answer very brief. I have a confession to make. So a little while ago, an agent reached out to me and said, I really love your poetry. Would you consider writing a novel? So I've been writing a very long poem that she believes is a novel. And I have to thank Ocean Vuong, because whenever she says to me some parts are too lyrical, I say, well, I'm just decolonizing the novel. Why do I need an arc? Are you trying to colonize me? And then she doesn't know what to say. But I will say one brief thing about poetry. I teach a class at UCLA called Reforming. I know I live in New York City. It's a long story. But anyway, I teach a class online for UCLA called Reframing the Form. And I look at how contemporary poets are, particularly poets of color, are reframing the form, whether it be the sonnet or sestina. And then a student of mine says, well, you never write in form. You're such a free verse, wild thing. And so I started writing sonnets. I wrote a series starting last year to celebrate the periodic table's 150th birthday. Do not laugh at me. I have a science background, okay? I come from chemistry and theoretical physics. Laugh all you want. Anyway, judgmental people. I celebrated the periodic table's 150th birthday by writing sonnets, and I called them the atomic sonnets, but then I completely reframe what people believe to be a sonnet while including certain attributes of the sonnet, which is like the turn at the end, right? The last two lines. But then I play with like space all over the page and just all sorts of things while working in the chemical properties of each periodic element. And I don't know, I mean, to everyone, I just say, reframe the form, mess with the form. I mean, you're probably already doing that anyway, so just take it to the limit and write those poems that are novels.
Thanks for that. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to also add, Ron, that I think to me the question of form and formation are always pretty closely interlinked. As you know, one sees in so many of the writers that Bronwen was just calling our attention to, that I don't think of it as something that one would impose, let's say, on a work, but in fact the form of the poem is also work being done on oneself and by implication on the larger world as well. Bringing into being new imaginative possibilities. And then I also wanted to say that I'll bet you have something to say about the question of whether form.
Yeah, but I want to get everybody out of here before 10 o'clock. So
Come on, Ron. We want to hear what you, come on.
Well, it's just sort of, I mean, you know, I mean, kind of, no, I'm trying to defer here, right? You know, but yeah, I find that, you know, I mean, sort of like, it's interesting because I think sort of like there's a lot more freedom in poetry and poetics to actually experiment with form more so than just like a codified idea of a novel. And yeah, I mean, that's where Ocean's work is actually really good. And I might steal that too, of just like, I'm just decolonizing, right? Or even though, I mean, but my favorite, you know, it's the formalists that I gravitate to most. Mostly because of, I mean, Bronwen sort of touched on it a little bit, just like with form, you can defamiliarize. Or you can also just kind of reinscribe certain practices that might have fallen out of favor. And you can actually simultaneously do both. And, you know, so that's sort of what, you know, and actually, Rosebud, I think your work does a lot of that, right? You know, so that's sort of kind of where I sit on it. But I'm pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool formalist in that kind of respect, even when I'm just sort of messing around. You know, but I do like, you know, I like to sort of combine and recombine forms just to, you know, just to really get at an interesting approach. But like I said, let's open it up for questions. I'm sure like most other people have things to say. And if not, you know, Sean, you can just tell me to shut up and you know, go home.
I would never.
I'll just add, I have specific kind of creative invitations for all the books I mentioned. So if anybody teaches and they'd like to see those, just email me and I'll send them to you. I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay. Well,
just connected to that form question, something I love to do is look at the level of the sentence. I think that's a place where we see that form is also like attitude and is also feeling. So on the level of the syntax or like a certain framing, you're already inviting someone into a certain like rhetorical position or attitude or affect just through that form of the grammar.
Well, anything else you want to say about form? Like, I mean, you know, it's wide open. Well, yeah, thanks for that. Right. Well, and thank you to you all actually for putting together this like incredible event. There's just so many books and so many ways to kind of take this and think about it. I think this has really been really fruitful, right? Hopefully you audience out there in virtual land have, you know, completely thoroughly kind of enjoyed this and we're able to kind of take things away. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. And yeah, have a great weekend and a great night. And thank you again, Sean, Jonathan, Bill Lavender, the entire NOLA Poetry Fest staff and people for making this happen. And thank you for your patience and good night.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank y'all for coming, everybody. We got a Nightboat Books reading tomorrow at 2 p.m. We got the Lip Balm Magic Show tomorrow at 4 p.m. And we got the Pan Dada Hit Parade at 7 p.m. tomorrow, which is going to be super weird and wild. Highly recommended.
I was part of the recording. I can guarantee the weirdness for sure.
Tell us a secret about tomorrow night. What's popping tomorrow night? What's going on?
I don't have, I mean, this is, you know, Mako's creation. There's a little YouTube video I can put in the chat. Yeah, it was really fun. Basically, we had a Zoom session to record, and okay, here's the best thing that happened. We performed the poetry vaccination. We performed the code of one of the vaccinations as a sound poem.
Awesome.
Internationally. So that's the teaser, Sean.
I'm teased. I need to be pleased tomorrow at 7 p.m.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. It was brilliant.
Bye, Jen. Bye, everyone. It was so nice to see you.
Yeah, and thanks again, all you got, you know, and thank
everyone.
you, my
Really
panelists. Thank you so much for everything that you did.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Let's catch up.
Yeah.
We'll do another Poets Theater someday, Laura.
Please, John, please.
Yes.
All right, guys, take care.
Bye.